and thank you all so very much for joining us this morning. So, as was mentioned, I'll be discussing crowdsourced forecasting today, which is a different way of approaching some of these forecasting and estimative techniques. So, just to kind of ground us in what crowdsourced forecasting is and how it works, I'm going to give a couple of definitions and discuss where it came from. So, crowdsourced forecasting is this idea where you take the quantitative predictions of a large group of people, you get them to input their expectations about future events or trends, and you have them expressed in terms of probabilities or ranges. And when you aggregate them together, when you aggregate the predictions of the crowd together, social science to date has shown that the crowd is more accurate than particularly experts in their own field. So where this came from, the field of crowdsourced forecasting is about 120 years old at this point. And so where it came from was there was a county fair in Oxford where a polymath by the name of Francis Galton, he went to this fair and he observed a competition they were having. And this competition was essentially guess the weight of the ox. And this fair and this market was filled with farmers, merchants, butchers, people who actually knew cattle, knew livestock, and made their living on knowing things about the cattle. But what Francis Galton observed was, even though this crowd was full of experts, it wasn't terribly good at guessing the weight of the ox. However, where the insight of crowdsourced forecasting came in was he took the average of the crowd together. And so this crowd had about 1,500 people, and he averaged all of their guesses. And he found was that this crowd in its entirety was only a couple of pounds off the actual weight of the ox. So if any of you ever did the kind of in elementary school or early education, where there was the jar of jelly beans and your teacher had you guess how many jelly beans were in the jar, and then they averaged all of the guesses together to show that the guesses actually approximated how many jelly beans were actually in the jar. And so it's that type of idea getting to the wisdom of the crowds. So that was where crowdsourced forecasting came from, but in those intervening 120 years, it has been refined in a couple of different ways. So in 2005, James Surowiecki published a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which was highlighting the value of collective intelligence, particularly for businesses and for business operations. Then moving into kind of the government and geopolitical sphere, in 2011, the U.S., it was the Intelligence and Advanced Research Projects Administration. They had launched a crowdsourced forecasting tournament that was designed to predict geopolitical events. And so the political psychologist Philip Tetlock and the organization that he helmed, which was called the Good Judgment Project, they won that tournament for several years in a row. And in fact, the Good Judgment Project, relying entirely on open source information, they actually performed about 34% better than the intelligence community, than the US intelligence community. And this was the intelligence community who had access to classified data. So despite having access to classified data, the Good Judgment Project and the crowd that Philip Tetlock was leveraging, they were performing about 34% better at predicting future geopolitical events. Coming out of those tournaments, they were called the ACE tournaments. Philip Tetlock published the book Super Forecasting, which provided a framework for individuals themselves to become better forecasters. And so we at the RAND Forecasting Initiative, we will teach that methodology as well about how to become better forecasters. But so this is where the enterprise of crowdsourced forecasting came into being. So the benefits of using, as opposed to leveraging particularly expert opinions, is that when you gather the opinions of multiple people and when you have a sufficiently large enough crowd to express their quantitative predictions, the individual or the impact of individual biases is mitigated. individuals can also be trained to improve their own forecast to produce a better aggregate estimate. And one of the findings that's particularly interesting here, going back to 2005, Philip Tetlock had wrote a book called Expert Political Judgment, where he was finding that that experts in particular were actually a little bit worse than a crowd at making predictions in their area of expertise. So I'm a political scientist by training, and so I'll pick on political scientists a little bit. So if you ask me to make predictions, let's say about voting behavior, what the research has found is that I will be a little bit worse because I default to what Daniel Kahneman called System 1 thinking. I will rely on my area of expertise, and I will give just a knee-jerk answer to when someone poses a question to me about voting behavior. When you ask someone a question about future events that's outside their area of expertise, they have to use what Kahneman calls System 2 thinking. So they have to approach the problem more systematically, and they don't rely on those heuristics, that kind of knee-jerk, this is my area of expertise, so I'm actually not going to engage terribly well with the question that's at hand. The research also showed that particularly along academic, and even more so when you get into government lines, that experts will take the bureaucratic line of the agency to which they work. And so it's this dual factor of bureaucratic lines, department lines, and defaulting to System 1 thinking in terms of area of expertise. That's what limits experts in making predictions about future events. Those similar factors are not present with a crowd. And so that's why leveraging this collective insight can produce more accurate estimates about future events. So this is what crowdsourced forecasting looks like today. And so the RAND Forecasting Initiative, we run our own platform on RFI. So this is what our platform looks like. We are not the only crowdsourced forecasting platform in town. If you've heard of Metaculus, if you've heard of Hypermind in France or Glimt in Sweden, these are all crowdsourced forecasting platforms. But this is what our platform currently looks like. And so we leverage a couple of different insights, and I'll talk about ways that we get analytical value from this at the end. But we have our questions at the top. We get running and continuously updating crowd estimates. And then particularly important for the government folks with whom we work, we get what are called rationales, which are these essential arguments about why a particular event will occur and why a particular event would not occur. So we can essentially pull the data that the crowd is using to make their predictions. And so when we can leverage that data in discussions with our government clients to say, these are the factors that have mattered for the crowd. So this was just one example, asking whether a US or US ally satellite would be permanently disabled by another country or organization before 1 January. And so this was as of mid-September, where it was 7% and 93%. But you can see how that data was leveraged in terms of China and Russia testing anti-satellite capabilities, the heightened geopolitical atmosphere, and the kind of ambiguity in the space domain. Those were the arguments why it would be feasible for a US ally or US ally satellite to be disabled, as opposed to the arguments why it would not occur. There's very little historical precedent. It would constitute an act of war, and there were strong deterrent effects. But we essentially get full data on why the crowd is making the expectations and the predictions that they are. So how RFI works to basically take the crowdsourced forecasting methodology and provide value to governments and others is we essentially work in this 4-step process. So we will begin by taking in strategic issues. And it really doesn't matter what those strategic issues are. We can work with geopolitical topics. We have active discussions with some folks in the Middle East and North Africa around relevant issues for that area of the world. We'll talk to healthcare folks. We will talk to people providing healthcare solutions for US veterans, for example. We will provide basically horizon scanning for the State Department. We've worked with the State Department's Policy Risks and Opportunities Group. So point being here is it doesn't really matter what the strategic issue is. It's not just related to national security, economics, healthcare, whatever else you might have. So we will take the strategic questions and we will break them down using a structured analytical process called the decomposition process into scenarios, drivers, and signals. And so scenarios are basically future worlds. And so particularly with the scenario component of this integrates quite well with scenario-based futures work, where people will take scenarios or a scenarios-based approach to understanding potential outcomes for the future. So we integrate that portion in. But then we also work with drivers, which are these scalable factors that might affect strategy. So just as a hypothetical example, it might be economic health, the strength of the economy. You can essentially scale up from a healthy and growing economy to a weak, stagnating economy. And that's a scalable factor that would affect strategy. And then you also have signals. And these signals are the specific metrics that we will track that would shed light on those drivers and shed light on those scenarios. So a specific signal we might use, just because we're in an OECD forum. OECD publishes fantastic data on unemployment rates. We might track unemployment rates, just as one example. And obviously, those unemployment rates would then shed light on the health of the economy. And then using the driver, the health of the economy, we might scale this up then to a specific scenario where we might have, we're expecting high growth over the next several years. And so it all becomes part of the same conversation. After we develop those signals, those metrics, we will launch specific crowd forecasting questions on our platform. And so the crowd will provide their estimates and their rationales. One thing I will mention, just in particular with these two middle steps, is one of the areas that we have been working on at RFI is to deploy artificial intelligence through this process. So we have a tool that we're already using called ARC, the Analyst Research Companion, to help with scenario decomposition. Feel free to reach out to me offline if you're interested in ARC and some of these other AI tools. I'm not going to delve into them terribly deeply here, but more than happy to continue that conversation at a later time as well. But then moving into the forecasting side of things, we have also started to do some experiments with AI forecasting agents. Just the research to date has shown that there are a couple of different ways to use AI in this space. You can just go ask an LLM to make their predictions. Research to date has shown that that single LLM will be a little bit worse than a crowd. Another approach is you can go ask a variety of different LLMs for their expectations, and you can get those expectations, average them, and that approach will get you to about a crowd level. And then there have been some companies that have deployed agentic AI, so specific AI agents that are designed to forecast. And there's been very good evidence that agentic AI approach will actually get you to a super forecaster level of predictions. But after you get the crowd forecast, the AI forecast, what have you, then RFI will get the results and we will do some analysis to show to aggregate the expectations of the crowd. We will incorporate with other methods. We will consult with experts. We will use it to inform scenario planning, wargaming, these other types of methods to deliver strategic insights that can ultimately help shape decision-making processes. And then essentially, you can start the process all over again, where you've done your analysis, then you can leverage new strategic issues and essentially start working through it again. So just to say just a little bit, this is the RFI crowd, but I just want to, there's a frequent question of, well, who is actually making the prediction? So I just wanted to highlight this a little bit. So this is the RFI platform in and of itself. Obviously, those other platforms that I mentioned will have different data. But I'll say the x-axis for these two, for the two graphs on the left is based on number of forecasts given. So when we have people making forecasts, the vast majority of the forecasts that we see on our platform are completed by people with graduate level education, people with masters or doctorates. Generally speaking, they're engaged in some full-time profession that's not policy making, academia, or some sort of student level. One of the other things is this field has gotten, some people have thought that it's underemployed amateurs who just have a lot of time to do the research. At least based on our platform, that's not the case. Forecasters, they really range in age from 18 to 75. And then our platform in general, we leverage data from forecasters in 33 different countries. And so we're actually getting a fairly global perspective on the questions that we're launching. A couple of other just mechanical things is we can launch a number of different forecasting question types that can be used to deliver insights in different ways. So there are binary questions, binomial questions. These are just straight yes, no. The example I gave about the US ally satellite, that's an example of a binomial or binary question. Yes, the event will occur. No, the event will not occur. We also have a variety of different types of multinomial questions where it could be a single outcome. Who's going to be the president on January 29th, 2029? There's only going to be one answer, even though there are a lot of possibilities there. We also have ordinal type questions where you're essentially asking based on a scale, how many of things will occur. We also have questions that will leverage multiple outcomes. So which OECD countries will have a head of government change before January 1st, 2027? There can be more than one answer to that. And so this would be a way of getting predictions on a whole lot of different countries. We have continuous questions which roll through different time periods. And then we have multiple time periods. So we could ask about, net revenue generation in quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four. So these are the different types of questions that we can leverage. But the last thing I'll mention here then is the different ways that we can translate crowdsourced data to analytical insight. And so we have a couple of different ways of getting at usable or translating crowdsourced forecasting data into usable estimates or usable insights. So we can use the point estimates that I showed. So this will give you the direction and magnitude of the crowd's opinion. So this can help to show you what future the crowd thinks is most likely and the strength of that belief. As I also mentioned, we can get the rationales that are underpinning the data. So we can understand why the crowd is thinking the way it does. And so one of the other interesting things we can do here, as I mentioned, we're pulling data from 33 different countries. And so we can actually separate the rationales based on location. So if we're asking questions, for example, about European security, there might be some very interesting findings if forecasters in Europe are thinking differently than forecasters in the United States or forecasters in Asia. We can leverage those. We can leverage those differences and and disaggregate the findings to get some interesting data. We can also use question clusters to leverage data from more than one question. So just one of the examples I'll give is if the crowd is expecting a certain unemployment level and is expecting AI to basically the performance of AI models to basically to continue expanding, we can essentially get at understanding what the crowd is thinking on how the AI is affecting the labor market or economic performance. We can also do trend analysis, and we can get at trends over time. So we can use those rationales to discover what developments have caused forecasts and forecasters to change their minds. And then one of the other things that we have found particularly useful at RAND is we will get subject matter experts to react to the data. So we would take crowdsourced forecasting data and we would basically get we have a number of economists on staff as an example. So we can get the economists to say, well, why might the crowd be thinking this way? How would the crowd forecasting in this particular manner change your understanding? So we can do this interaction with the subject matter experts. And then we can also leverage a number of different methodologies. So we can also integrate crowdsourced forecasting into scenario planning for wargaming, using the crowd to have differing expectations on to inform different scenarios. We can use Delphi method, where we get the crowd to basically iterate and to understand how the crowd is forecasting, or to reach consensus on a particular policy topic that is being informed by crowdsourced forecasting data. So there are a number of different ways that you can that we at RFI or others can leverage the crowdsourced forecasting data to deliver analytical insights.